Welcome to the special edition of Chatter That Matters. What I have in store for you are three of the smartest Canadians that I know, Arlene Dickinson, Jon Love, and Dany Assaf. I had the honor to interview them in front of an audience at Excellence Canada's 40th anniversary. And to kick off the morning, I delivered a short keynote. Paraphrase it, I talked about my pride being a Canadian. And then I took the audience back to 1967 when I was a young boy. And I got to celebrate Canada's 100th birthday. And what a year. We had a caravan, a Centennial train, and of course, Expo 67 in my hometown of Montreal. What an engineering feat. Built 3 man-made islands, tunneled under the St. Lawrence to extend our subway, or what we called the Metro. We built a monorail. Every country put their best foot forward, but nothing compared to Canada and the provinces. We demonstrated Canada stood for and why we mattered. And I wondered if it was just my rose-colored glasses, that moment in time, or did Canada really stand for something? Well, for 2 years, we've been flying this new flag called the Maple Leaf. Pearson was our prime minister. We also had one of the highest per capita incomes. We had a growing middle class. The Canadian dream was within arm's reach of desire. Immigrants that would come to this country could do whatever they wanted to do because the circumstances existed. Infrastructure, we built a Trans-Canada Highway in 12 years, the St. Lawrence Seaway in 5 years. And our social conscience, we said to the world that on watch, we could bring universal health care and the Canadian pension plan and unemployment insurance to our people. We set up such conditions for success that we continue to roar as a country. BlackBerry, Nortel, Couche-Tard, Cirque du Soleil, and so many other major innovations in healthcare, sciences, and technology. We had some of the best universities in the world, and we were a country known as peacekeepers, where tolerance was something the world admired and respected. But then I asked, what happened? Food banks are overrun, tents have become affordable housing, unemployment's on the rise, capital's fleeing the country, and so is our talent. We've buried future generations in so much debt, it's like they'll be wading through cement their entire life. Well, I want to change that. I want the Canada that has a prosperity agenda back. I want the country that was known as peacekeepers, as tolerant, as a place to be, as a place to invent, as a place to access your dreams. Do we have what it takes to reclaim the Canada we all want and deserve? Well, now I turn the spotlight on Arlene Dickinson, Jon Love, and Dany Assaf to hear what they have to say about making Canada, the true north, strong and free. Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Thank you for listening to Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. If you can, please subscribe to the podcast, and ratings and reviews, well, they're always welcome and they're always appreciated. So Arlene, I brought you up first. I'll begin with you. Age 30, 4 kids, divorced, no education, no prospects. Take us back to what you did then and how the conditions in Canada allowed you to do what you needed to do.
I was reminiscing and I was singing Canada. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
When he was talking about the train coming through, you remember that? I remember that. And I was thinking about how romantic it sounded and how great it sounded. And the challenge that we have sometimes is that it's easy to say we want to go back to the way we were. Things were good back then and when we rethink them, but there was also lots of challenges back then. 1988, the year that I got divorced. So I'm a newly divorced mom of 4 without a high school education, but no other education and no skills or training, trying to figure out how to make a living in Alberta, a very oil and gas energy focused province where there was a lot of male leaders, but not a lot of female in business. It was also 1988, interest rates were about 10.75%. So when we think about how bad they are now, they went from 1988 to about 10.75% to about 13.5% in the next couple of years. And our mortgage was up to 18%. You know, I was divorced and had no kind of prospects. Everyone was afraid that Russia was going to start a war tomorrow and World War III was about to break out. There was a lot of fear in the country and a lot of worry. We were overtaxed and underpopulated. We introduced our very first climate targets in 1988 as a country. There was a lot happening in that period of time that was worrisome and troubling and could be, as an entrepreneur, things to stop you from saying, I don't want to do this. But for me, because I wanted to build something and because I couldn't get a job anywhere, And so I decided that I would, start a communication company, which is not really something that the country needed more of, but I decided that there could be a different way to do it. And so it was troubling times in many respects. And there's a lot of parallels to today. Inflation, still worried about what's going on with world geopolitics, still worried about what's going on with our climate, still concerned about all those things. But I think what's the same from then and now is this hope that Tony talks about, this dream, this ambition to be a stronger nation, to be better together. And I held on to that. I held on to this idea that, I could help create a better future for this country. As an immigrant, I was taught to be very grateful for being here in Canada, that here I was in a country that I could do anything I wanted to do whenever I wanted to do it. And all I had to do was work hard. And if I worked hard, I could get rewarded.
Arlene, you just did a great Venture Park conference. I talked to a couple of people who were there. They said it was amazing. A lot of young people. Do you think that they have that same mentality that says, if I work hard, I'm guaranteed success?
No. And I think the question is, Tony, is that because the world, is it because it's so much worse now? Or is it because there's no regulations on social media and there's nobody tempering and calming the waters in terms of what people can say and do on social media? It is such a negative impact. I mean, who wants to read every single time you pick up a social media platform how bad things are and horrible? It affects all of us. It affects our mental health. It makes us believe it to be true. And I think it's not to say that that's all it is, but I do think that's a big piece of why you're seeing kind of the malaise you're seeing. It was hard to own a house in 1988 too. It was different. I mean, it's still achievable. I do think that we're victims of algorithms and dopamine that comes from looking at social media to try and get a hit of what's happening in the world. And we don't have enough critical thinking. And your point about educating and making sure people are trained on not just electoral challenges and what's going on in political scenes, but in general, I think is the biggest issue in our country.
So, John, we talked about earlier, we're just talking about that it's very difficult for a politician to live in the middle anymore, given that attention's their oxygen and attention's on social media.
To live in the middle, you can't garner the kind of support you need, and you just garner attack. So that's why we're seeing divisions on both sides of the border. And while we look to the U.S., the current U.S. situation with some horror, it's not a lot different here. The fact is that, over the last 20 years, globalization and technology has created an enormous amount of wealth. It just has not been distributed very equally. So when you read a headline like over the last 10 years, our GDP per capita is stagnant, well, that's on average. Many of us actually have done fine, which means many of others have done much more poorly. And it's those people that are increasingly unhappy because they've been left out of the grand bargain of globalization and technology.
And Dany, your book is just wonderful. And I love your personal stories, including the Muslim kid in Edmonton that wanted to be a professional hockey player.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the conditions you as a kid. You came out of Alberta and you become one of the definitive minds when it comes to how Canada needs to play chess on the global trade scene.
I reflect, a lot on my childhood in Alberta as I look across the country today. And, it's characterized by a few core things. First, there was an intense sense of belonging, optimism, and I grew up knowing there would always be opportunity. It could be channeled into opportunity, into what Arlene was talking about, which really reflected the Canadian promise. The promise that if you do these things, it's most probable that you will be successful and be able to live the Canadian dream. So today, when I hear the conversations, the core thing that's missing, the beginning of it, is belief. Nothing starts without believing in something, because it softens all of the edges, because it's true. There's always been, if you look at it across history, it's not unique. There are people who hate. There are people who are unproductive. That cannot be. There's no generation that's different. Arlene said back then, interest rates were, there's always something. And why is it that we were able to overcome? Because we believed. And that creates the consensus. And that's the Alberta that I grew up in, where my great-grandfather came from Lebanon in the 1930s. He came in the 30s because his cousin and his family came from some small village In the early 1900s, they became furriers. They became farmers. They did what was available. And from that, they built the first mosque in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada in 1938. It was finished. The real first little mosque on the prairie. That's the embrace of Canada. And that's the promise that we have to reclaim. Once we reclaim that and we draw upon our history, we've done it before, then the best chapter is yet to be written about this country.
Jon, I use this analogy of castles and drawbridges. And, I look at the private sector, often subsidies and consolidation and protecting what I have, my status quo. And don't blame unions. They've earned certain things for their members. They want more. Education wants to protect tenure. Everybody wants to protect what they have. How do we get people to come to the middle ground and say, we're going to all might have to give up something to create a growing pie versus all attacking the shrinking pie?
Do we as a collective think that growing the pie is important? That may sound obvious, but you don't find in contemporary politics much of a prosperity agenda. Instead, we continually get exposed to wedge issues, more regulation, more taxes, more, whatever it is. We don't have a prosperity agenda. No one's talking about how are we going to grow the economy? How are we going to give more people more opportunity to create businesses, to create jobs, to create tax revenue, et cetera? Instead, all we talk about is how are we going to regulate and add more regulations. And so that it discourages investment, it discourages entrepreneurship, and it makes everything more difficult. And as we look at whatever our challenges we have today, things like the housing crisis, which is, from my perspective, existential, it is 100% the result of bad public policy. Good public policy can reverse that issue. But we need, as a collective, to start talking about to our politicians, to our constituents, to our neighbors, to our friends, to our community, where is the prosperity agenda? The energy industry in Canada is 20% of our entire GDP. It's 15% of the jobs of our country, the energy industry. And there are governments who won't engage with the leaders of the energy industry, the largest industry in the country, which, sort of tells you where we are as a country. Massive untapped opportunity.
I can campaign on a set of promises, and then when I'm in office, I can do a material change, and there's no national referendum. It just simply becomes, now that I have power, I can choose what I do. Do you think part of our issue is that we as voters are so tolerant for that? I believe that a promise made is a promise kept. Private sector works that way. Why shouldn't government work that way, that says if this is our policy, whether it's deficit, immigration, healthcare, dental care, whatever we're invested in, prosperity, that if that's what I'm elected on, that's what I have to deliver on. And if not, I have to seek the approval of voters.
I'll give the Trudeau government credit. In 2015, they ran on marijuana and a deficit. They delivered both. In 2019, they ran on gender, Indigenous, climate. They've made progress on all those agendas. The narrow issue is what Canadians want is not on their agenda, because Canadians are concerned with housing, cost of living, opportunity, taxes, roads. Which is why in the polls, they're in slight difficulty.
I think too, anytime you have an economy that's driven by public sector employment versus private sector employment, you are in a place where there isn't going to be good productivity for the nation or innovation happening in the nation. You start to see this imbalance in terms of who we're going to put in power and what they run on. They're running on a short-term tactical approach to getting votes as opposed to a long-term strategy for how they're going to build the country. And that takes courage to say, I'm going to do these things when maybe your special interest groups don't like those things, or maybe the people that are speaking to you. And frankly, let's face it, I think one of the challenges in our governments over time has been that the people who have the leaders' ears are the elite in the country. They do not represent the majority of the country. And so you have whispering in politicians' ears people who do not need the things that the average Canadian needs and are out of touch with that reality.
There's a question I've asked. Are we going to continue as voters to accept that you can run on any promise, and when you're in power, things that are materially different to your promise, allowed to do it? So Dany, first,
well, I think, necessity is the mother of all invention. Maybe we have become complacent and it really didn't matter. So we had a wide tolerance for that. But now we're starting to feel like these are very serious times. So, like you're on a plane, autopilot. It's great when there's no turbulence or anything like that. But when there are turbulent times, you want that person in that cockpit to know how to handle this plane. And maybe we are in those times and it matters. And the people are smart enough to know. So I think it's going to come back. And I love Jon and Arlene, what they're talking about is this prosperity agenda and entrepreneurship. So it's easy. Every day, get up, take shots at things. Don't like. You know what's harder? Pick something that's positive, create a consensus around that. That's harder. And, as a father and as a Canadian like all of you, you're like, what's the next big thing that's going to make my kids feel that optimism? And then it's going to be reflected in opportunity. I wrote a book about it, and it was a simple idea. I talked about my great-grandfather coming. It was the agricultural age. Let's just call it was the agricultural age. Big trend. What did they do? They went out to the West. They went out to farms. They got farm implements. They worked the land. They never imagined you're going to build a metropolis like this. Who would have thought? Today, what is it? Big picture. Digital age. The digital farmland. What's happened? The tools of productivity have been democratized. They're all in our hands. Give the people the tools to work the digital farmland, and you just never know what they're going to be able to build. And that's where that opportunity comes, and where this entrepreneurship and this prosperity agenda can maybe come together to create that wave where that next chapter can be.
So, Arlene, I want to go to you on that because you're so vested. You're a champion of small business. How do we create a prosperity agenda for entrepreneurs in Canada that says we're creating the circumstances to dream it and do it and not feel embarrassed by becoming wealthy for it, not becoming embarrassed about being successful for it?
I mean, it's exactly what Jon said. We need a strategy and we need a plan for entrepreneurship in this country. It has to be declared that Canada is supportive of entrepreneurs, and it has not been declared that way in any way. In fact, the capital gains tax that we just saw implemented says the exact opposite. In fact, it should be as simple as you can incorporate for free. If you invest in a first-time entrepreneur, there's some tax saving for that. The first dollars that you earn as an entrepreneur should be taxed at a lower rate. There are some simple measures that Canada as a country could stand behind that say to the world, we are in support of entrepreneurship. Those things do not exist today. The superclusters, billions of dollars put into superclusters, but no accountability to whether those superclusters have actually delivered any value in terms of long-term entrepreneurial innovation. We are a country that grows our ingredients. We do not commercialize our ingredients. The last mile of commercialization is where the value is. We are a country that invests in R&D and in IP and then sell our R&D and our IP to other nations who turn it into products and services that we then buy back. We are not creating a strategic framework that allows entrepreneurs to be successful.
You raise a good point on superclusters. The amount of money that our governments give to businesses drives me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The province of Prince Edward Island actually gives more money to businesses than they collect in business tax revenue. If you're Prince Edward Island, why don't you say, we're not going to give businesses any money and we're not going to charge taxes? It could be a tax haven. Wouldn't that be a gig? I mean, we've got to get government out of picking winners and losers,
right,
regulations and all that. I mean, if we want to unleash creativity and the entrepreneur, it's not about giving them incentives and everything else. Just get out of the way.
We have spent so much money working the government and so little working for taxpayers. So how do we change that?
The Fraser Institute's just done an interesting paper on how to balance the budget. And how to balance the budget is actually cutting personal taxes, cutting corporate taxes, and eliminating 49 different programs, subsidies, loopholes, et cetera. In other words, simplifying the tax code actually creates enough money to balance the budget. The tax code never gets simplified, it only gets complicated.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate. You come out with this agenda and everybody, oh yeah, you're going to take care of the rich, they're going to get not paid taxes. How about me? I'm struggling. Like, how do we change the narrative in this country so that everybody goes, to you, it's common sense?
We have the tall poppy syndrome in Canada. We have it in spades where if somebody is successful, we want to, chop them down so that they don't stand out too much. We need to do the exact opposite. So in order to change it, we need to elevate the successful entrepreneurs, just like Excellence Canada is doing. How do you elevate excellence? How do you show it as a beacon as opposed to a tax opportunity? And the rhetoric that we're getting from government about excellence. We have to start celebrating success.
Here's another issue. Jon brought it up, our natural resources. How important it is to our economy, more importantly, maybe to the Western democracies. I'd rather have a national North American energy strategy, and I'd rather have my allies know that it's not Putin that's got the hand of natural gas, but it's coming from Canada. How do we change this so the average voter says, bullshit, this is part of our strategy going forward, because the wealth that we create can set up future generations for success?
I think there's another key concept that we need to keep in mind, which is trust. If you are in a team and you trust one another, you know that the whole is going to be greater than the sum of the parts. So belief and trust, very basic building blocks. From there, it does play into natural resources, which is, this is a collective asset of our nation. This is what we've been blessed with this. How do we provide these things to a world that's demanding them and needs them in a way that's going to enrich us, education and healthcare and all the things that are hallmarks of our nation, and also do it in a way we're going to be leaders in preserving the climate. These are the things. We have a conversation where we create consensus. I'll do this, you do that. Shared sacrifice. Shared sacrifice. If you feel what you're contributing is somehow going to benefit you as well, then that creates, again, an opportunity for people to say things like Jon is describing. Do you know that if we just tax one another endlessly, we'll create less wealth? Here's how we make more money. By unleashing everybody, you're all going to get an opportunity to make the most of the digital economy, to make the most of whether you work in resources. Your chance is going to be dictated by you. And when you get that success, it's going to be something that's going to be reflected in the success of everybody in our country.
In a moment, more of my in-depth conversation with Arlene Dickinson, Jon Love, and Dany Assaf.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Investing in Canada? Well, that matters to RBC. $500 billion in sustainable financing to combat climate change. $500 million for future launch. A 10-year program to prepare youth for the jobs of tomorrow. Helping to discover the next generation of Olympians, artists monetizing their talents, women entrepreneurs pursuing their dreams, supporting mental health, and so much more. Investing in Canada, well, that matters to RBC.
On the special edition of Chatter That Matters, we're talking all things Canada, past, present, and future. And joining me are three of Canada's leading thinkers, Arlene Dickinson, Jon Love, and Dany Assaf. Everything you're talking about sounds wonderful. I'm getting so excited. We're going to lift Canada, but, well, is that going to get me elected in my riding? Is that interest groups, the lobbyists that are taking care of me? All these people whispering in my ear. How do we get to the point, putting narrative out saying it absolutely is about Canada and future Canadians' prosperity? It's about personalizing. It's about your grandkids. It's about people that are coming into this country, their success, they're chasing the dreams. So it's worth going after it versus being torn apart by fringes of society.
Do we dare to dream? If you look at some of the great speeches of history, Martin Luther's Dare to Dream, Churchill's war speeches, and so on, they all have a common theme. Are we able to be something better than we are today? As Canadians, do we want to take on a big challenge? I'll give you a big challenge. Over the next 30 years, India's growth of its coal-fired generating capacity to generate electricity will generate more emissions than Canada does as a country. Why don't we, as a country, disintermediate the burning of coal for energy globally? We've got all the resources, we have all the skills, we have finances. We are uniquely positioned to actually make a difference in climate change if we want to. And it involves every province. Everybody's got a stake in this narrative. We could dare dream that we, in fact, could make an impact. What we need is leadership. When I talk about tax cuts, I'm not talking about tax cuts for the rich. God knows I don't need a tax cut. We need to make sure we get money in people's pockets. That's what they're interested in, their standard of living. And that's how I would do tax cuts. And if we wanted to go down and really think about deregulation and how, what regulation is really not needed and what frustrates the growth of business and what drives capital and talent out of this country. Every time I see capital and talent leave the country, I see tax revenue also go with it.
So I want to build, and you said we just need leadership. You started with the word leadership. I would put up lawn signs for any one of you three if you ran for politics. None of you want to run because of the circumstances of our democracy right now. How do we change that so that people of your caliber that can communicate, that have a social conscience, that care about people, not just their own pocketbooks, absolutely step into the public arena and run?
I think the political game requires a very different skill set, but I don't have the skills to be a politician. But why don't we look at a model where I think it uses business skills very thoughtfully? In the US, you elect a president who appoints a cabinet, and that cabinet all comes from anywhere he wants. It's not elected people. He or she has the ability to select, some of the leading minds and says to someone, Dany, I want to give you a role and it's 2 years or it's 4 years. Here's the mandate. Here's the department. Go at it. If we had the ability to do that in Canada, you could attract lots of super high quality talent that would be happy to work for $1 a year around a specific mission.
Arlene?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about Finance Minister Bill Moreau, who came from the private sector and had a mandate similar to it, I think if you talk to him today, he would say it was incredibly difficult to turn the tide in terms of what his mandate was. And so, what we're seeing play out in the U.S. is exactly what you're talking about here, which is we've got one leader down there who is talking about the way things were. Let's go back to how it was. It was better. It was better in the past. We want to, make America great again. It was all about what we said earlier, like the past was so beautiful. It wasn't. And then we've got another leader talking about hope and dreams and a vision for the future. There's this challenging thing about communication, and you know it's better than anybody, Tony, to get your message out there as a politician is so incredibly difficult because things get crazily blown out of proportion. Why don't we run? Well, I'm like you. I don't think I have the skills to be a politician. I'm not very politically inclined. I'll say that I shouldn't say.
How do we change the circumstances of government? I'm not anti-democracy. I'm just saying everything else has changed. Your business has changed. I have to believe over 50 years. Entrepreneurship has changed. Law's changed. Everything's changed. How do we change the conditions so that people with a heart, a head, and a bias for action have an ability to influence how this country's run?
We all have to think about this, how we're going to participate in our democracy. My real job is I'm a competition lawyer, and I think of how do you change the dynamics of any market. Maybe it's ideas like we need a new party. You need competition. You've got these parties which have had great history. They've all done great things. It's not to disparage anybody. But when things get locked in, you need a new entrant. These folks have built businesses. They've seen the great success, and God willing, they'll see more. And you talk about their strategy, and people will have memos, they'll have PowerPoints, they'll have all kinds of things. The one thing that can put an immediate stop to all of that is they pick up a paper, they get a call from a customer saying their competitor did something unique. I'll tell you, that clears the decks.
Let's talk about immigration. This country was built on immigrants. Some of my best podcasts, either refugees or immigrants, it is what's made this country magical. Now the narrative is so anti-immigrant, and it's becoming a political football. And these are human lives. These are people. Many of them come here going, I've given up everything to come to Canada, very often for their kids. I'm a doctor. I'll drive an Uber if my kids can have a better life. What do we need to do as a country to reclaim the sense that immigration matters, and the right immigration is going to help lift us to where we need to go?
Okay, so can you imagine sitting around the cabinet table and say, why don't we grow the population of Canada by 10% over, say, 3 or 4 years, which is what's happened? In this high growth environment, everything's stressed. Healthcare, social infrastructure, everything's stressed. We don't have enough houses, et cetera, et cetera. So, the growth strategy, I'm pro-growth, the growth strategy wasn't accompanied by, what if you have growth? Like, it's amazing. So in the second quarter of this year, we welcomed 250,000 new Canadians to Canada. And we built enough houses for 150,000 of them. Now, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to say where are the other 100,000 people supposed to live. New Canadians have built an enormous amount of wealth for all of us and our country. We want more of them, and we need a policy that is accompanied by how do we support these people?
We are a mosaic as a country. We are not a melting pot. We are comprised of many different types of ethnicities and cultures, and that's what makes our country great. And when we bring in people who have ideas that come from, whether, let's say somebody comes from Europe where they're used to high density, small, like we want to build mansions. Well, no, maybe we need to build smaller homes, and maybe we need to make them more affordable. And we need to figure out how to, ensure that everybody has an opportunity at home ownership. If you're in BC, good luck. We know what the issues are. But to your point, Tony, how do we fix this?
Okay, can I give you just two sound bites on housing? Because I'm here.
Yeah.
In Toronto, city of Toronto, if you build an apartment building, a third of the cost of the building are taxes.
It's ridiculous.
So if you didn't have all those taxes, you could charge 2/3 the rent. And people like us would be super happy about that because you are more likely to fill up the building. Second thing is, to get a building built typically takes 5 years of negotiation with the city. We have an affordable housing project that's now under construction. 420 is Valhalla Business Park, so 427 and Dundas. So this is affordable housing, geothermal, zero carbon. Okay? So you might think that would be attractive, but we end up in this exhaustive struggle.
All three of my guests, Arlene Dickinson, Jon Love, and Dany Assaf, have joined me previously on Chatter That Matters. Today, we're focusing on what matters most to Canada. AI, invented really in Canada. I've been working in AI now for 4 months. It's either going to be something that allows you to soar, or it's going to be the greatest sledgehammer that ever hit you. And there's nothing in the middle. What's your take on how AI can play a role, positive role, in what we're talking about today in finding a way to be much more efficient and much more pragmatic in terms of how we shape policy and introduce policy in this country?
AI is part of this digital farmland, and we did invent it. So this is a fascinating new experiment in how we're going to go from basically building the technology to how we commercialize it. So oil, I don't know how many eras of oil there was, booms, and we still weren't able to refine it and make the more value-added products. Critical minerals, we're going to take it out of the ground. Are we going to build those batteries? We're trying, okay? But AI, this is really our strength. We developed this technology. Are we going to be able to commercialize it? And where's the promise? So I've seen statistics. They say that AI itself is going to add 7% to global GDP. That is $7, $8, $9 trillion are going to be added. Not only that, the wealth it's going to create, the opportunity. Who built Facebook? Who built Amazon? All these, they were unfamiliar names. Who is going to be those next people who are going to develop technology and AI that are going to revolutionize our way of life? They could be Canadian. And then when we think of the potential of it and efficiency, another big thing to tie in, productivity. We have a productivity problem. AI is the solution to that. Just think of the things you'll be able to do more efficiently. We were talking about it earlier today. Things that used to take a year can take a day. Think about in pharma. There are all these papers written over decades about how this molecule interacts with that molecule, They go into a desk or into a file folder. Now AI can correlate decades of research to tell you, boom, that's the molecule that's going to cure this disease. We have the people, we have the institutions, our schools. What are our strengths? In addition to minerals, our education system, our universities, those are the gold mines of the future. All those kids coming out of those schools, those are where that best chapter is going to be written. So this is our moment to seize it. It is now.
Jon, I mean, if you were running on an election on one thing that matters most to Canada, one thing that we say we're all going to get every voter to say, yes, that makes sense, what would it be?
Prosperity.
Do you think voters are capable of understanding prosperity? Because there's two things. You're going to come in and talk about prosperity, and I'm going to offer you universal health care, or I'm going to offer you free dental care, or I'm going to offer you whatever free prize inside. What do we need to do as a nation to make sure voters are voting not just for today, but ultimately for what Canada can become?
In communication, there's two styles. There's those that can simplify, and that there's those that complicate. And, you know, great leadership can take the concept of prosperity and simplify that and make it personal to each of us. Because while it's interesting to hear about more social programs, how are they funded? It's prosperity. While it's great to listen, to think about more education, pick whatever you want, but it's all funded by the same thing, which is more prosperity. And prosperity doesn't happen in a vacuum. Government's role is to set the stage, set the rules of the game, and encourage prosperity. And that is what I think a compelling leader could galvanize the country with.
But it seems like such hard work when they're just offering me something for free. Because what I understand, hard work. No, but I'm just saying, as terms of reaching a voter.
I'm talking about your personal prosperity.
Yeah.
I'm talking about your standard of living. I'm talking about, you know, if we think there's a housing crisis because we measure it by, you know, how many people, you know, don't have a house or whatever, think about all the underhoused. Those are people that are in a one-bedroom apartment that would prefer to be in a two, et cetera, right? Because density in housing has increased because people don't have options. You know, we've got a large population that would like to improve their standard of living. So that is prosperity. And I would make it personal to you and the country.
How do you make the debt personal? So I realize that, because when I talk to a lot of young people, they don't personalize the debt as theirs. They think deficit is very different.
Debt is simple. I'm living on my grandchildren's bill because they have to pay it back.
Dany, I'm going to talk to you in terms of some major negotiations. Canada is a trading nation. We're an export nation. What do we need to do to ensure that our destiny is a matter of choice and not left to the chance or the whim of maybe a new leader in the United States or what's happening politically around the world?
I think we need a clear-eyed strategy of how we're going to create prosperity. So the number one thing behind that is that your children are going to be better off than you. That is the fundamental promise. And then from there, how do you create wealth? You need people. They need to be educated and healthy, just normal stuff. They need tools, a hammer, a computer, whatever it is. They need infrastructure. They need broadband, highways, whatever to go there. And at the end of that line, whatever you do, you need two things to make those a reality. You need capital to bring your idea really to life and give it scale. That's the oxygen. And then finally, you need to be able to sell it to somebody. How do 40 million people create the kind of wealth and the standard of living we have in a world of 8 billion? You need to leverage that. And that is through trade agreements. Look across the world. We have our dear friends and allies. They will always be our core partners. There's no doubt. Whether the president comes or goes, whoever it is, we got to negotiate in our greatest self-national interest to make sure that we get the best deal for Canadians. But at the same time, we need to take a little bit of a Swiss approach of a little bit of neutrality, look out to the world and say, who are our next trading partners, and make sure that we have strong connections built off of our diverse population. Again, another one of our assets. People here from all around the world who have connections there, and to see that those relationships are just as valued as our traditional relationships.
So Dany, while we're at it, and it sounds wonderful, we probably have the worst interprovincial trade agreements. I mean, we have better free trade with many countries around the world than we do inside our borders. And geez, the last thing I want to do is impact somebody that might not get me elected. How do we change this country so that there's free trade with them?
I think it's simple. Does any one province think you're going to be wealthier alone than together? If you do, good luck. Take a look around the world. It's not so simple. We need to unify here first to become stronger outside. And that's the message we need to get out to across Canada, within Canadians, to know that this world there's a lot of disruption, there's a lot of transformation, there's a lot of risk, but again, there's a lot of opportunity in that if we come together here so we can be stronger abroad.
And Arlene, too many talented individuals, entrepreneurs, are leaving this country. Too much capital is flowing away from this country. What do we need to do? Because this country is entrepreneurs. What do we need to do to make it the lifeblood going forward? That not only are they going to stay here and build their businesses here, but the more Shopifys are going to be here, but we're going to attract some of the best talent around the world because this is the fertile ground to grow.
We need to celebrate entrepreneurs. We need to invest in entrepreneurs, and we need to buy from entrepreneurs. And if we do those things, we will elevate entrepreneurs to a place where they can actually prosper.
You know, I always end my Chatter That Matters podcast with my 3 takeaways. And Jon, what I took away from you, the most important word is prosperity. Start selling a prosperity agenda. Let people know what it's like to have that as a North Star and what it means for me personally if we're all in it together. I think, Dany, your passion and just the simple word of belief, how important it is to believe in positivity and possibility and what it would mean to sort of elevate us so that switches on every day. And Arlene, interesting enough, that is this concept of tall poppy. And I think you're right. If Terry Fox was an American, they would have torn down the Statue of Liberty and built a Terry Fox statue. Canada has had so many extraordinary things. We don't make these people our heroes. We don't make them our crusaders. We don't talk about the employment they've created, the wealth they've mattered, how they've culturally impacted this country. And I think we got to do a lot more of elevating the tall poppy versus trying to cut it off at the stem. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think these 3 deserve an incredible round of applause.
Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chatter That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.